Many companies have failed because they ignored the data. With Coca-Cola's New Coke, it was a different story. They spent millions on research and marketing. They ran nearly 200,000 taste tests. By every conventional measure, they did their homework. And they still got it catastrophically wrong. When New Coke launched in 1985, replacing the original 99-year-old formula, it triggered a massive public backlash. After only 3 months, Coca-Cola was forced to bring the original back. But how could such a carefully researched decision end in complete failure? The answer lies in a few powerful psychological principles. And it turns out there were warning signs hidden in the data all along. But before we get into that, let's briefly cover the backstory. By the early 80s, Coca-Cola was in trouble. The Cola-Pepsi advertising war was in full swing, and Pepsi had found an especially effective format, the Pepsi Challenge. Since 1975, Pepsi had been running a simple campaign. Set up a table in a shopping mall, hand strangers 2 unlabeled cups, ask them to pick their favorite.
Pepsi!
More often than not, people chose Pepsi. And Pepsi was loud about it. Coca-Cola's market share, once considered untouchable, was declining. For the first time in decades, Pepsi outsold Coke in supermarkets. In response, Coca-Cola started a secret project nicknamed Kansas. Over the years, researchers conducted 190,000 taste tests, as well as surveys and focus group studies. The results? Consumers preferred a sweeter formula to the original Coke. The data was unambiguous, or at least it seemed that way. So on April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola launched New Coke and pulled the original version from the shelves. It wasn't long until the phones started ringing. Coca-Cola's consumer hotline, 800-GET-COKE, normally handled around 400 calls a day. It was suddenly getting thousands. People started stockpiling the original Coke. They took to the streets, and they formed protest groups, such as the Old Cola Drinkers of America. After only 3 months, Coca-Cola announced that they were bringing back the original formula. Now, let's talk about why New Coke failed so spectacularly, despite consumers actually preferring its taste. To understand what went wrong, we're going to look at 2 concepts from behavioral economics. The first concept is called loss aversion. In the late 1970s, 2 psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, published a paper that would eventually win a Nobel Prize. It was called prospect theory, and it contained one finding that changed how we understand human decision-making forever. Losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. So, if someone gave you $100, you'd be pleased. If they took $100 from you, you'd feel significantly worse. Not equally worse, but roughly twice as bad. Now, the way Coca-Cola launched New Coke, not as a new product line, but as a replacement, implied a loss of the original. The taste people had since childhood, the thing they associated with holidays, with their grandfather, with baseball games in summer, was gone. And that loss, according to Kahneman and Tversky, hit about twice as hard as any pleasure the new taste could deliver. The second concept we're going to look at is called psychological reactance. It can be summed up as follows. When you take away someone's freedom to choose something, they want it more. A seminal study on this was conducted by Brehm and Weintraub in 1977. They gave 2-year-old boys 2 toys to play with. One placed right next to them, one behind a plexiglass barrier they couldn't get past. Both toys were equally desirable. And yet the children consistently reached for the one behind the barrier. The obstacle itself created the desire. It wasn't the taste of the original Coke that suddenly made it so precious. It was its sudden scarcity. And this mechanism is more common than you'd think. Every time an online shop tells you only 3 left in stock, they use a deliberate psychological trigger. The threat of losing access amplifies the desire for the product. But reactance is much more than just a marketing trick. The sociologist James C. Davies observed the same mechanism playing out at the scale of entire societies, arguing that the most dangerous moment for a government isn't when people have nothing, but when they've had something taken away. Some of the biggest uprisings in history were sparked by the sudden loss of rights or prosperity people had grown accustomed to. Coca-Cola removing a soft drink is obviously not on par with political oppression, but people's reaction to it was based on the same psychological mechanism. And with reactance as the lens, something in Coca-Cola's data suddenly stands out. As mentioned, they had run many blind taste tests, but they'd also run non-blind tests, where participants knew which formula they were tasting. In those tests, approval of new Coke was actually 6% higher. At first glance, a slam dunk. Consumers preferred it blindly, and they liked it even more when they knew what it was. But as psychology professor and author Robert Cialdini argues in his book Influence, this preference in the non-blind test actually measured something else entirely: reactance. When new Coke wasn't available yet, when it existed only as a future thing people couldn't have, they wanted it more. So they rated it higher than they would have purely based on taste. But this effect cuts both ways. Once new Coke was released and the original became unattainable, the script flipped. Suddenly, people desperately wanted the old Coke back. Now, to be fair, the concept of reactance was not as well understood in the 1980s as it is today. But there was a second warning sign in the data that Coca-Cola failed to recognize. Robert Schindler, in his 1992 paper, The Real Lesson of New Coke, points to something management largely ignored: the qualitative research. From a purely quantitative perspective, the surveys told a clear story. A majority preferred the new formula, with only 10 to 12% rejecting it outright, and that was enough to drive the decision. But the focus groups told a different story. Once 1 or 2 loyal Coke drinkers spoke up about their Coke being changed,
"They changed my Coke."
the entire group shifted. One vocal loyalist could flip a room. The same minority that was dismissed as statistically insignificant later triggered media outrage, protests, and widespread shifts in public opinion. Coca-Cola had this information in their data. They just underestimated the influence of opinion leaders on group sentiment. Lastly, there's also a methodological flaw worth noting. The taste tests were conducted in small sips, and a sweeter formula tends to win on the first hit. But sweetness that works in a single sip can become cloying over an entire can. So, could Coca-Cola have seen the backlash coming by factoring all of this in? Possibly. But it almost doesn't matter, because the story has an ironic twist. To this day, New Coke remains a cautionary tale. A reminder that tampering with an established, beloved product carries risks that are hard to quantify. Identity and psychology are often far more powerful drivers of consumer behavior than the product itself. Pepsi gleefully declared victory. But when Coca-Cola brought the original back, sales surged beyond anything they'd seen before the crisis. The chaos had achieved what no marketing campaign could. It reminded an entire generation of Americans how much they loved the original product. That emotional imprint proved so durable that decades later, even the failed product itself became nostalgic, headlining a limited edition crossover with Stranger Things. The debacle worked out so well for Coca-Cola that some people, to this day, believe it was intentional. A masterclass in manufactured scarcity. It wasn't. When asked about it later, Coca-Cola's president Donald Keogh dismissed the theory with words that are hard to improve on. "We're not that dumb." And we are not that smart.